Ay, ay, ay. Okay, I think I did it. I think I figured it out this time. So, anyway, bear with me for a moment. I just, before we started, I just had a horrible sneezing fit. This is one of the problems, by the way, with doing things in my office where the cat lives. Not that I'm allergic, but just sometimes, you know, the miasma of cat dander. Anyway, who cares? Good evening. It is 7:01 Pacific Daylight Time here on the California coast, and I am glad to see you all. And I'm Tad. I'm going to be reading. Many of you probably have figured out both of those things already, and that's why you earn the big bucks. Anyway, while I am preparing, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to pass along. I think I've mentioned all these things already, but because I'm working on all the different books at the same time. So I'm doing stuff for Brothers of the Wind, which is coming out in a couple of months. I'm doing stuff for Into the Narrow Dark, which is now the name of the third volume of the 4-volume trilogy of Last King of Ostenard. And I'm trying to finish up the actual last volume, which is still called The Navigator's Children. So all those things are going on at once. My head is full of Ostenard, and now I'm going to flip over and try and read Shadowmarch, which was stuff that I used to know 20 years ago. And it just makes interesting. It makes everything interesting. So other than that, not much to report. We are all pretty well here. We are doing, yeah, we're doing well. We're you know, just hanging in. Everybody's still being cautious because of, you know, Delta variants and all those kinds of things for COVID. And we're trying to take care of each other and get along with each other, which generally we do fairly well, which is a miracle in and of itself and something to be grateful for. So anyway, so that's where we're at here. Hope you guys are all the same. And I'm going to check in and see who's popped in to announce themselves. Kenneth. Good evening, Kenneth. Good to see you. Claudia. Hello. Jerry. Hello, Jerry. Mr. Unangst. We meet again indeed. Emily. Hello, Emily. Good to see you. Barb Ann. Same to you. Jeremy. The Mystic Wave. Yeah, I don't know what that was. That was just, you know, I have sudden moments of panic of like, oh, wait, I have to flip the thing on and what'll I do while I'm waiting for it to come on? Because you can't tell because it counts down, but sometimes it actually starts before the countdown ends. So if you're sitting there with your fingers shoved up your nose or something, it's really embarrassing. So you have to be ready, and it always surprises me. Anyway, so hello, Jeremy. Good to see you. Tim, hello. Kristen, hello. Alexis, hey, you too, MC McRib Sandwich. Oh, wait, I'm MC McRib Sandwich? All right, well, then you are MC Hamburglar. So, robble. Nancy, hi, Nancy. Um, I'm glad to hear that I helped you through folding the laundry, especially since I helped you through folding laundry without having to fold any laundry myself, which is something I'm actually going to have to do pretty quickly too, because I got to wash some stuff. Kelly, hello. Hand is normal. Hand is like it always is. I mean, it's a permanent thing with me. You know, it's not a big deal. I don't want to make a big deal out of it. It's just, you know, I just have a lot of inflammatory issues and I'm on meds for it and all that kind of stuff. So not that interesting. Many people have many worse problems. Sometimes it flares up a bit more than others. It's not arthritis. Apparently it's just, you know, a 30-year program of weird joints. Don't ask me. Anyway, but thank you for asking. Jason, hello. Good evening. Good to have you here. Ray, a pleasure. Will there be anything more forthcoming, Ray asks, from the War of the Flowers universe? I would love to. And the main thing at the moment is that we're thinking about a lot of stuff about what's coming next. I don't have any immediate plans for anything, but I suspect that one of the things that I will want to do is to write more different kinds of things. I have spent most of the last 6 or 7 years working on Ostenard. I might need to take a break and do something else. So can't say anything for certain. I'm still I'm still open to things. I'm looking at different possibilities. I'm wondering what I will do next. So you don't know. And I don't want to talk about anything too much because again, things change. Publishing is very weird at the moment, and my own particular publishing is a bit strange too for various reasons. So not anything to do with any of my current publishers, DAW or any of those folks. Hodder in the UK and Klett in Germany, they're all lovely publishers, and I'm very happy with them. But in general, with publishing, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. Hi, Alexis. I think I answered the question earlier for Kelly. The paw it's okay. It's up and down on all my. The thing is, at any given time, I could actually be wearing a brace on any one of 6 or 7 or 8 different sort of painful joints. So it's pretty arbitrary which ones I get it. Usually, it has more to do with like, oh yeah, there's my left hand wrist brace or something. Like, okay, good, I'll use that for now. But if I really wanted to, I would look like, if I really wanted to properly brace all of my sore joints, I would look like a hockey goalie. Anyway, Beth, hello. Good to see you. James, a pleasure. Walter, Lord of Disutility, is fine. He is yappy and loud, but he is a-okay. If he was just yapping just now, and that's what occasioned your question, it was probably because they were being fed upstairs sometime. They usually get fed by 6:30, but it may be late tonight. Carl, hello. Good to see you. Cliff, hello, Cliff. Good to see you too. Brenna, a pleasure. You're listening while baking coffee, cake, and cookies. Oh, why are you not here? Margaret, hello. Good to see you. You just got your power back. Oh, I'm glad to hear that because that sucks. We live in the hills, and there are more than a few times every year that our power goes off, including at one point we lost it for, almost 48 hours. It really makes you feel like a big snowflake. When your power goes off, you're like, oh, I can't do anything. You're like, geez, what did people do for thousands of years when they didn't have computers and all that stuff? It's shocking. How did they ever get along? How did they possibly build the pyramids without iPhones? Anyway, so yeah, I'm glad you got your power back. I always hate it when ours goes off. And I hate it in part because the kids are just miserable. They're like trudging around the house, and if it's nighttime, then they've got all the candles lit, like suddenly we're going to be attacked by vampire bats or something. Sherry, good to see you. Hi. Mahmoud, not too late. Yes, all is well here. Michael, hey, how you doing, buddy? Good to see you. Michael writes, among other things, Mr. Heath writes a column frequently for the tadwilliams.com website. So that is the Gruber's Grotto, and that's what he is referring to. And it is, as always, good to see you. I don't know if we've seen you here yet. Who else we got here? Yes, and Jeremy is responding to the appearance of Mr. Heath. Anyway, so, although Michael's probably Mr. Lane Heath. I always get confused with these things. My ex-wife was one of the first people that I ever knew to try to hyphenate a last name way back when. As you will have noticed, Deborah hasn't hyphenated and has just kept her last name, which is also more than fine with me, because I didn't change my last name, so I don't know why she should have to change hers. But my ex tried to hyphenate, and it was back in the 80s, and it just completely screwed up. Not anybody's fault except the systems, but it completely screwed up all the banking and health systems, and most of them you put a hyphen in anything, and it was like drawing a big red line across it saying, ignore this entire form, or whatever. So anyway, how did I get to that? Oh, because Michael Lane Heath, and I think Lane Heath is Michael's last name. I'll have to ask you. Mike, you can let me know if you care. Anyway, so good to see you all. I am just about to start reading, now that I have babbled in a babblicious sort of way for a while. And what were we reading last? We were reading last, Quiniton was meeting with the chief and paramount wife of the autarch, whose name is Orimini. As you can see, one of the things about these books, the Shadowmarch books, is that unlike the Ostenard books, where the classical underpinning was based more on the Roman Empire. Now, that's obviously we're many hundreds of years in the Ostenard books past that kind of point. But Naban and the history of the place is much more similar to Europe post the Roman Empire. And because of that, a lot of the words and languages, especially the ones from Naban, are specifically Latinate. Whereas in the Shadowmarch books, there's two other themes, which are primarily that the underlying root languages are closer to Greek, and that the pantheon itself of the main characters, like the Eden family, the pantheon is actually loosely based on Slavic pantheons. So I don't know why I'm telling you all that. I just figured some of you might be interested in that sort of thing. Anyway, so we go back to the seclusion, and specifically to the palace in the seclusion that belongs to Orimini, the paramount wife, the beautiful and very intimidating paramount wife, who has invited Quiniton to come and socialize with her. And Quiniton is nervous as hell, because of course this is the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Anyway, so we continue. This is Orimini talking. Good. In truth, he is very harmless, this man. So old that I do not think he could mount a mouse. She laughed between her teeth, and her serving girls echoed her. He is a storyteller. Shall I summon him? The question was not meant to be answered. Orimini lifted her hands and clapped. A moment later, a bent figure in colorful clothes stepped through one of the curtained doors and into the receiving room. Hasuris, she said. I apologize for keeping you waiting. I would rather wait for you in a dark alcove than be served honeyed figs by any other woman, mistress. The old man bowed low to Orimini, then gave Quiniton a look so saucy and self-satisfied that he might as well have winked at her. And this must be the young wife you told me of. Greetings, little mistress. You are a shameless flirt, Hasuris, said Orimini, laughing. None of your nonsense, or the Golden One's guards will come, and you will join the favored. My stones and I adventure together only in memory, great queen, he said. So it makes little difference, but I suppose their departure could be painful, so I will stay silent and behave well. No, to behave well you must not stay silent at all. Instead, you must tell us a story. Why else would I have brought you here? To admire the turn of my calf? Wretched old fool! Tell us a tale, perhaps. Pondering, or pretending to, the paramount wife put a finger to her red lips. Even Quiniton could not help staring at her like a lovesick boy. Perhaps the story of the foolish hen. Very well, great queen. The old man bowed. Now that he was closer, Quentin could see that his white whiskers were stained yellow around his mouth. "Here is the tale, although it is a rather simple one, without any good jokes but the last one. Once there was a very foolish hen who preened and preened herself, certain that she was the most beautiful of her kind in all creation. The other hens grew weary of her posturing and began to talk behind her back, but the foolish hen paid no attention at all. Jealous, that is all they are, she told herself. Who cares what they think? They are of no importance compared to the man who feeds us. That is someone whose opinion matters, and who will recognize my quality." So she set out to gain the attention of the man who came every day to spread corn on the ground. Every time he arrived, she would push her way out from the midst of the other hens, and strut back and forth before the man, head held high, breast shoved forward. When he looked away, she would call to him, "Gah-gah, gah-gah," until he looked her way again. But still he treated her no differently from any of the others. The foolish hen became very angry and resolved to do whatever it took to be noticed. Quentin was feeling a chill again. Was there a point to this story? Was Arimony suggesting that the younger wife had gone out of her way somehow to attract attention? The autarch's? Or someone else's? It was all too difficult to understand, but the penalties would be no less mortal, because the crimes weren't altogether clear. She suddenly wanted nothing more than to be back in the temple of the hive, surrounded by the sweet hum of the sacred bees. The foolish hen could not sleep for trying to imagine a way to get the man's attention. Her lovely voice had not moved him. Perhaps he needed to see that she valued him more than the others did. But how could she do that? She resolved to eat more of the corn he dropped than anyone else, and so she followed him from the first moment he arrived until he went away again, pecking at the other hens to drive them away and eating as much corn as she could manage. The other hens despised her as she grew fatter and sleeker, but still the man did not speak to her, did not single her out in any way. She decided she would fly to him and show him that she alone was worthy of his attention. It was not easy, because by now she was quite plump, but by practicing every day she at last managed to stay aloft long enough to flutter a good distance. One day, after the man finished spreading the corn and began to walk back to the house, the hen flew after him. It was harder than she thought it would be, and she did not catch up to him until he had already gone through the door. She hurried after and flew inside, but it was dark, and she could not see, so she began to call out, "Gaw-gaw, gaw-gaw," to let him know she had arrived. The man came to her and picked her up. Her heart was full of joy. "I have tried to ignore you, you fat thing," he said, "because I was going to save you for the feast of the rising at the end of the rainy season. But here you are in my kitchen, shouting at the top of your lungs. Clearly it is the great God's will that I eat you now." And so speaking, he wrung her neck and set a fire in the oven. Quentin stood suddenly, and the old man Hasuris fell silent. He looked a little shamefaced, as if he had somehow guessed the story might upset her. "I don't feel very well," she said. She was dizzy and sick to her stomach. Arimony looked at her with wide eyes. "My poor little sister! Can I get you something?" "No, I think I had better go home. I'm very sorry." She put her hand over her mouth. She had a sudden, powerful urge to vomit all over the first wife's beautiful striped cushions. "Oh, no, must you really? Perhaps it would be better for you to have a little more mint tea. Surely that would settle your stomach." Arimony picked up Quentin's cup and held it out to her, gaze doe innocent. "Go ahead, little sister. Drink some more. It is made to my special recipe, and it cures nearly all ills." Filled with horror, Quiniton shook her head and stumbled out without even bowing. She heard the slaves laughing and whispering behind her. Chapter 29. The Shining Man. 5 white walls. Here is the shape with its tail in its mouth. Here is the inside turned outside, the outside in. From the Bonefall Oracles. "Listen carefully," Churt said when he had put some distance between himself and the temple of the metamorphic brothers. He raised his hand to his shoulder to let Beetledown climb onto his palm, then held him so that he could see the man's tiny face. "If your nose is telling you the truth, and this is the way Flint went, I think I know where he's going." "If my nose?" The rooftopper's features screwed up in indignation. "Wasn't bred for it like the grand and worthy, me, but leaving on out, there may not be a better sniffer in all of the Southmarch Heights." I believe you." Chirk took a deep, shaky breath. "It's just that where he's headed." His knees felt weak, and he had to sit down, which he did, carefully. The rooftopper was still standing on his hand. For the first time that Churt Blue Quartz could remember, he wished he were outside, under the sky, instead of beneath the unimaginable weight of stone that had been the top of his world almost all his life, and had always held that place in his thoughts. "Where he's headed is a very strange place." Sounds like the food has arrived upstairs. "Where he's headed is a very strange place, a sacred place. Sometimes it can be a dangerous place." "Cats? Snakes?" The rooftopper's eyes were wide. Despite his growing fear, Churt almost smiled. No, nothing like that. "Well, there might be animals down there, but that's the least of my worries." "Because they're the giant." Now Churt did smile. Being called a giant was something that would probably never happen to him again. "Fair enough. But what I need to tell you is that I have a decision to make. It's not an easy one." The little man looked at him now with keen interest, just like Cinnabar or one of the other guild leaders being presented with a tricky but possibly lucrative bargain. The rooftoppers were not just like people, they were people. Churt knew that now. They were just as complicated and lively as the Funderlings or anyone else. So why were they so small? Where did they come from? Had they been punished by the gods, or was there something even stranger in their origins? Thoughts of the gods and their fabled propensity for vengeance were, at this moment, more compelling than usual. "Here's my problem," he told Beetledown. "I told you before that places like the temple, that some of my people might frown on you being there. We are uncomfortable with outsiders seeing the things that are most important to us." "Understood," said the little man. "Well, I think Flint has gone deeper still into what we call the mysteries. And I know that many of my people will be upset if I bring an outsider there. It was one reason I haven't even taken Flint anywhere near the place, even though he is my foundling son." "Then time is come for me to go back to my own home." Beetledown sounded quite cheerful about it, and Churt wasn't surprised. The little man had become less comfortable the longer and deeper their journey became. In fact, he seemed positively to glow with satisfaction at the thought that his travels below ground were about to end, which made Churt's already wretched position even more so. "But I'm afraid to lose so much time. If the boy's down there, it's been hours already. It's a dangerous place, Beetledown. Strange, too. I'm very frightened for him." "So?" The rooftopper frowned in puzzlement, then gradually his tiny brows unkinked, although the understanding obviously brought him no happiness. "Thou wants to take me down with?" I can't think of anything else to do, any other way to track him. There are many paths, many ways. I'm sorry, but I won't take you against your will.
Thou'rt much the bigger of us twain.
That doesn't matter. I won't take you against your will. Beetledown's frown returned.
That's that it was a sacred place, banned to outliers.
That's why I said I had a difficult decision. But I've decided I'd rather break the law and take you into the mysteries than leave my boy alone down there any longer than I have to. If you'll go. Besides, the boy himself is no funderling, so the law's already fair cracked and riven, as we say. The little man sighed, a minuscule noise like the squeak of a worried mouse.
My queen bade me give ye help with nose and otherwise. Can Beetledown the bowman do less than un's mistress bids un?
The Earth Elders bring you and all your people good luck, said Chert, relieved. You are as brave as you keep saying you are.
That be the solemn truth.
Their paths intersected at the doorway of the armory. Vanson had his arms full of polishing cloths, which he was borrowing since they had run out in the guards' hall, and he almost did not see her. In fact, almost knocked her over. Astonishingly, she seemed to be alone. She was dressed in a simple long shirt and breeches, like a man's, and Ferris Vanson was so surprised to see the face that had been in his mind's eye all day that for a long moment, he simply couldn't believe it was true. My lady, he said at last. Highness, here, you must not do that. It's not fitting. Princess Bryony had been picking up his dropped cloths, her face wearing a pleasantly distracted expression that was almost insulting. It was obvious that she did not recognize him outside of the formal setting of an audience or a council chamber. Her features abruptly changed and tightened, eyebrows lifting in a formal gesture of polite surprise. Captain Vanson, she said coolly. He had a brief glimpse of her guards, 2 of his own men, hurrying toward them across the armory courtyard as if their own captain might be a threat to the princess. Your pardon, please, Highness. He did his best to get out of her way, a gesture made difficult not only by the fact that she was holding the handle of the door, but because he was full laden and she was not. He only managed it by clumsily dropping a few of the cloths again as he backed into the armory. He hid his terrible embarrassment by bending to pick them up. God save me! Even when we meet almost as equals, alone, in the armory doorway, I immediately turn myself into a bumbling peasant. A second, equally unpleasant thought suggested that maybe this was just as well. After all, the sooner you get over this stupidity, the better, a more sensible part of himself pointed out. If shame alone will do that, then shame is a good thing. He glanced up at her face, saw the mixture of amusement and annoyance moving there. He had managed to block her way again. But I will never get over it, he thought. And in that painful, radiant instant, he couldn't imagine knowing anything with more certainty. Not his love of his family, not his duty to the guards, or to the all-seeing gods themselves. Princess Bryony suddenly seemed to realize she was smiling at his discomfiture. The transition of her features back to bland watchfulness was astonishingly swift, and more than a little saddening. Such a lively face, he thought. But over the past weeks she had been slowly, purposefully turning it into something else. The marble mask of a portrait bust, something that might stand for decades in one of the castle's dusty halls. Do you need any help, Captain Vanson? She nodded to her 2 hurrying protectors. One of these guards could help you carry those things. She would lend him one of his own guardsmen to help him carry a few pieces of cloth. Was it real malice or just girlish snippiness? No, Highness, I can manage. Thank you. He bent a knee and bowed a little, careful not to drop his burden again. She took the hint and moved from the doorway so that he could escape. although he had to glare her two panting guards back out of the way first. He was so relieved to escape her overwhelming presence that it was all he could do after a final turn and bow, to walk rather than run away. "Captain Vanson," he winced, then wheeled to face her again. "Yes, Highness." "I do not approve of my brother appointing himself head of this expedition. You know that." "It seemed clear, Highness." "But he is my brother, and I love him. I have already—" Oddly, she smiled, but it was clear she was also fighting tears. "I have already lost one brother. Beric is the only one I have left to me." He swallowed. "Highness, your brother's death was—" She raised her hand. At another time, he might have thought she was being imperious. "Enough! I do not say it to blame you again. I just—" She turned away for a moment so she could dab at her eyes with the long sleeve of her man's shirt, as though the tears were little enemies that had to be swiftly and brutally eradicated. "I am asking you, Captain Vanson, to remember that Beric Eden is not just a prince, not just a member of the ruling family. He is my brother, my twin. I am terrified that something might happen to him." Ferris was moved. Even the guardsmen, a pair of young louts who Vanson knew well and did not think could muster the finer feelings of a shoat between them, were nervous now, unsettled by the openness of the Princess Regent's grief. "I will do my best, Highness," he told her. "Please believe that. I will treat him as though he were my own brother." Immediately upon saying it, he realized that he had been foolish again, had insinuated that under ordinary circumstances he would give more care to his own family than to his lord and master, the Prince Regent. This seemed a particularly dangerous thing to say, considering that one Prince Regent had already died, while he, Vanson, was the officer of record. "I am truly an idiot," he thought, "blinded by my feelings. I have spoken to the mistress of the kingdom as though she were a crofter's daughter from the next farm over." To his surprise, though, there were tears in Bryony's eyes again. "Thank you, Captain Vanson," was all she said. She had looked forward all morning to stealing a little time for practice, being desperate for the release of swinging the heavy wooden sword, but now that the time had finally come, it only made her feel clumsy and tired. It is that man Vanson. He always unsettled her, made her angry and disturbed. Just seeing him reminded her of Kendrick, of that terrible night. And now it seemed he might be standing by to watch another of her brothers die, for none of her arguments could make Beric change his mind. But was it Vanson's fault? Or was it only some terrible joke of the gods that he should be attached to so much of her misery? Nothing made sense. She let the sword drop into the sawdust of the practice ring. One of the guards moved forward to pick it up, but she waved him off. Nothing made sense. She was miserable. Sister Uta! She had scarcely had time for her tutor lately, and Bryony suddenly realized how much she missed the older woman's calming presence. She snatched up a cloth to wipe her hands, then stamped her feet to shake off the sawdust before setting out for Uta's apartments, guards scuttling after her like chickens behind a grain-scattering farmwife. She had crossed the courtyard and was just walking into the long, narrow lesser hall when, for the second time in an hour, she nearly knocked over a young man. It was not Vanson this time, but the young poet. Well, the so-called poet, she could not help thinking, Matty Tinwright. He reacted with elaborately pleased surprise, but by the care he had put into his hair and clothes, his swift breathing, and his position just inside the doorway, she rather thought he had been watching her come across the courtyard from one of the windows, and then had hurried down the hall to manufacture this accidental meeting. Highness, Princess Bryony, lovely and serene and wise, it is a pleasure beyond words to see you. And look, you are robed for battle, as is fitting for a warrior queen. He leaned in close for a conspiratorial whisper. I have heard that our land is threatened, glorious princess, that the army is being mustered. Would that I were the one. Would that I were one who could neatly raise a sword as your champion. But my own war must be fought with stirring songs and odes, inducers of brave deeds, which I will construct for the good of crown and country. He was not at all bad to look at. He was in fact quite handsome, which was likely one of the reasons Varric disliked him. But she was far too impatient for even this harmless nonsense today. Do you want to go with the army, so you can write poems about the battlefield, Master Tinwright? You have my permission. Now, if you will excuse me. He seemed to be swallowing something the size of a shuttlecock. Go with the army. Yes, you may. Now, if that was all. But He seemed dazed, as though the possibility that he might be directed to join the army of Southmarch had never occurred to him. In truth, Bryony was mostly being spiteful. She did not actually wish to saddle any commander with both her brother and this idiot poet. But I did not come to ask. Tinwright swallowed again. It was not getting easier for him. In truth, I came to you, Highness, because Gil wishes an audience with you. Gil? The pot boy, mistress. Surely you have not forgotten already, since it was his errand that first brought me to your attention. She remembered him now, the thin man with the strange, calmly mad eyes. The one who has dreams? He wishes to speak to me? Tinwright nodded eagerly. Yes, Highness. I was visiting him in the stronghold. The poor man scarcely sees anyone. He is almost a prisoner. And he asked me specially to speak to you. He says that he has something important to tell you of what he called the upcoming struggle. For a moment, Tinwright's forehead wrinkled. I was surprised to hear him use such a term, to be honest, mistress, since he is not at all educated. Bryony shook her head as if to clear it, a bit overwhelmed by the poet's swift and highly inflected speech. He was a popinjay and more than just his cheap street finery. Gil the pot boy wants to talk to me about the upcoming struggle? He must have heard about it from the guards in the stronghold. The stronghold held another prisoner, she could not help remembering. A moment of dislocation washed over her, something approaching real panic. Shazo Danheza was the one who should be commanding both this war party and the defense of the castle that might come later. Someone anticipated just that. Had he been made to look guilty of Kendrick's murder for just that reason? Yes, Highness, Tinwright confirmed. Doubtless that was where he heard of it. In any case, that is the message I was asked to give you. Now, about this riding off with the soldiers. I already gave you my permission, she said, then turned and headed off at a fast walk toward Sister Uta's room. Behind her, she could hear her guards snarling as they struggled to push past Mattie Tinwright, who seemed to be following her. But Highness, she turned. The pot boy, he gave you a gold dolphin to write that letter, did he not? Yes. So where did a pot boy get a thick, shiny gold piece? She saw that Tinwright obviously had no answer to that and turned away again. I don't know, but, Highness, about what you said, the army... Her mind was too full. She scarcely even heard him. We do not often go deeper than the temple, Chert explained to his small passenger as they made their way down the twisting slope known as the Cascade Stair. The curve of the wide spiral, at its uppermost reaches wider in circumference than Thunderling Town itself, was beginning to tighten. The The curve of the wide spiral at its uppermost reaches, wider in circumference than Thunderling Town itself, was beginning to tighten, and the air was noticeably warmer. A seam of white quartz in the limestone directly above them seemed to undulate back and forth above their heads like a snake as Chert descended. They had left the last of the Thunderling wall lamps behind. Chert was glad he had brought coral from the salt pool. I think the acolytes come down this way to make offerings, especially on festival days, and of course all of us come here for the ceremonies when we reach manhood or womanhood. Even with all his worries, he couldn't help wondering how many young ones the acolytes would take down into the depths this year. Chert would know them all, of course. Thunderling Town was a small, clannish community, and there were never more than a couple of dozen who had reached the proper age on the night the mysteries were formally celebrated. As he walked, he told Beetledown some memories from his own initiation into adulthood, so many years ago now. The giddiness brought on by fasting, the strange shadows and voices, and most frightening and exhilarating of all, that brief glimpse of the Shining Man that the young Chert had not been entirely certain was real. In fact, much of the experience now seemed like a dream.
Shining Man?
Asked Beetledown. Chert shook his head. Forget I said it. The others will already think it bad enough I bring you to these sacred places. As they stepped down from the cascade stair and into a natural cavern full of tall, hourglass-shaped columns, Chert walked forward until they stood in front of the one unnatural thing in the chamber. It was a wall, even larger than the silk door, with 5 big arched doorways in it, each one a black hole into which the coral light could not reach.
5?
Said Beetledown.
And thy people not better do than dig tunnels side by side?
Chert was still keeping his voice low, although the unlit lamps in these chambers suggested that if the acolytes had been down today, they had already left. That is more to do with the weight of stone and less to do with the number of tunnels. If you cut one tunnel, it makes an arch in the fabric of the living stone above it. I cannot think of the words to explain it, since we use an old Thunderling word, tjok, to describe such a thing. That one arch will be a small one, and eventually the stone above it will crush the tunnel closed again.
Wind from the peak,
swore Beetledown, scrambling in from the point of Chert's shoulder to the presumably greater protection next to the Thunderling's head, making Chert's neck itch and tickle in the process.
The stone crushes them?
Even that doesn't happen right away, never fear. But when you make several tunnels beside each other, the arch in the stone is much bigger and stronger, and even when the weight of the stone above starts to collapse it at last, it takes the outer tunnels first, giving us plenty of warning to shore up the inside tunnels, and eventually to stop using them altogether.
You mean someday mountain will just crush all down? All thy building? All thy digging?
He sounded almost more outraged on the Thunderling's behalf than fearful of the danger. Chert laughed a soft laugh. Someday. But that's a long time. That's stone time, as we call it. Unless the gods take it into their minds to send an earth-shaking, a far stronger one than we've ever had before, even these outside tunnels will still be standing when the grandchildren of the men and women joining the guilds today are brought down for their coming of age. His explanation didn't seem to mollify Beetledown all that much, although the little man was reassured when Chert chose the middle tunnel, presumably the safest, to continue their journey, and Chert didn't share the less inspiring truth with him, that nobody ever used any of the other tunnels anyway, since they existed purely to support the passage through which he and the rooftopper were descending to the next level.
But why build tunnels here at all?
Beetledown asked suddenly, perhaps to break the silence in the close-quartered passage, whose abstract carvings seemed just as weirdly unsettling to Chert now as they had on that long-ago night of his initiation, and which must seem even more so to a stranger like the tiny man.
All else down here in deeps be touched by no hand.
Again, Chert was struck by the sharpness of the little man's wits and his keen eye for details in an unfamiliar place. A good question, that. But Chert was beginning to feel the power of the place, the importance and the strangeness of it, and did not feel much like talking. His people didn't enter the mysteries lightly, and even though he would walk into the smoking heart of Jezkral pit itself to find the boy and save his Opal from feeling so miserable, he could not be happy about his responsibility for this comparative parade of outsiders, first Flint and now Beetledown, both of whom were in the ceremony depths because of Chert blue quartz and no other. I don't want to tell the whole story now. Perhaps it will be enough to say that our ancestors came to realize that there was another set of caverns they could not reach, and that they cut these tunnels to reach down from the caverns we knew, those in which we have been traveling until now, into these deeper and more unfamiliar spaces. It was not enough, of course. It barely explained anything, let alone the profound revelations at the heart of the mysteries, but there was only so much that could be put into words, or that should even be put into words at all. The idea of needing to talk to the potboy had upset her, but not because of the potboy himself. Even if the fellow was some kind of dream scryer, even if he could do to her what he did to Barrick, calling up and naming the things that haunted her sleep, what Bryony feared was no secret from anyone who had any wits at all. She feared that she would lose her brother and father, what remained of her family. She feared that she would fail Southmarch and the March kingdoms, that in this time of growing danger, with Olin imprisoned and her brother strange and often ill, she would be the last of the Eddens to wield power. No, I will not let that happen, she swore to herself as she strode along the lesser hall toward the residence. I will be ruthless if it is needed. I will burn down all the forests that lie beyond the shadow line, throw every Tali into chains, and if Shazo truly is a murderer, I will drag him to the headsman's block myself to save our kingdom. This was what had upset her, of course, the thought of her father's trusted adviser still locked up in the stronghold during such times. If she went to see the potboy Gil in his makeshift accommodations there, could she avoid speaking to Shazo? She didn't even want to see him. She was not certain of his guilt and never had been, despite all the signs, but much of the autumn had passed with no change in the circumstances, and she and Barrick couldn't avoid passing judgment on him forever. If he had murdered the reigning prince, he must himself be put to death. Still, Bryony knew she didn't really understand what had happened that fatal night, and the idea of executing one of her father's closest advisers, a man who also, for all his sour temper and rigidity, had been almost another parent to her, was very disturbing. No, it was terrifying. Her guards had caught up to her again as she reached the high-walled rose garden, where the lesser hall became a covered walkway that ran the garden's length. It was sometimes called the Traitor's Garden, because an angry noble had lain in wait there to murder one of Bryony's royal ancestors, Kellic II. The assassin had failed, and his head had wound up on the basilisk gate, the tattered remains of his quartered body shared out over the entrances of the cardinal towers. Something of this legend had stuck to the garden, and it was not her favorite place, even in spring. Now the roses were long gone, their thorny branches so thick on the walls that it looked as though they were holding up the ancient bricks, rather than the other way around. Caught up in her thoughts, Bryony barely noticed her guards until one of them sneezed and mumbled a quiet prayer. She suddenly thought, what am I doing? Why should I go down to the stronghold? I am the queen, almost, the princess regent. I will have the potboy brought to one of the council chambers and speak to him there. There is no need for me to go down there at all. The relief that washed over her brought a little shame with it. This would be another day. She did not need to think too much about Shazo Dan Heza. She was startled by a pressure on either side as the two guards suddenly stepped in close to her, like a pair of dogs heading a straying sheep. She was about to snap at them. Bryony Edmund would not be anyone's lamb, when she saw a man and a woman rise from a bench in the late autumn sun and walk toward her. It took her a moment to recognize the first of the pair before they joined her in the shade of the walkway. She had not seen Hendon Tolly for almost a year. "Your Highness," he said, sketching a not very convincing bow. The youngest Tolly brother was still thin as a racing dog, all length and tendon. His dark hair had been cut high above his ears in the current Siamese style, and he even wore a little tuft of beard on his chin. With his short gown in golden satin and his party-colored hose and velvet trim, he looked every inch a prince of one of the more fashion-conscious southern courts. Bryony thought it was strange that he could look both so much like his brother Galen in the face and so little like him in all else. Dark for fair, slim for well-muscled, foppish for stolid, as though this were Galen himself dressed up for some outrageous, impossible midsummer festival mummery. "Ah, I see by your attire we have caught you at a bad time, Princess Bryony," Hendon said with an edge of superiority in his voice that was meant to make her bristle, and did. "You have apparently been engaged in something strenuous." She barely resisted the temptation to look down at what she had worn to practice at the armory. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wished she were dressed properly in the full panoply of her position. "Oh, but there are no bad times for relatives," was what she said, as sweetly as she could. "And family is, of course, permitted a certain informality of both dress and speech. But even among family, one can go too far." She smiled, with teeth showing. "You will, of course, forgive me for meeting you while dressed this way, dear cousin." "Oh, Highness, the fault is all ours. My sister-in-law was so anxious to meet you that I took a chance we might find you out and about. This is Elan McCoy, the sister of my brother Caradon's wife." The girl made an elaborate courtesy. "Your Highness." "We were introduced at your sister's wedding, I think." Bryony was furious that she should be forced to stand here in her sweaty clothes, but Hendon Tolly was playing a deliberate game, and she would not let him see her irritation. She concentrated instead on the young woman, who was roughly her age and pretty in a translucent, long-boned way. Unlike her brother-in-law, Elan kept her eyes cast down and offered little in the way of reply to Bryony's equally perfunctory questions. "I really must go," Bryony announced at last. "There is much to do. Lord Tolly, you and I must speak on important matters. Will this evening suit you? And of course you will join us for supper, I hope. We missed your company last night." "Tired from the journey," he said, "and with worry for my missing brother, of course. Doubtless fears for Duke Galen have made things difficult for you too, Highness." "It seems there is a conspiracy to make things difficult for me, Lord Tolly, and your brother's sudden absence is certainly one of them. You might also have heard that my brother Kendrick died." He raised an eyebrow at this broad stroke. "But of course, Highness, of course. I was devastated when I heard the news, but I was traveling in northern Siam at the moment, and since Galen was actually here to represent the family at the funeral, yes, certainly." She suddenly wondered what had really brought Hendon here, now, of all times. The 2 or 3 day ride from Summerfield Court seemed a bit of a long distance to come simply to cause trouble. Bryony couldn't forget Brone's spy and his warning that the autarch had been in touch with the Tollys, although she couldn't quite make sense of it. She did not put treachery beyond them, but it seemed a large step and a large risk for a family that was already living a fat and comfortable life. Still, as her father had always said, the prospect of a throne could make people do some very strange things indeed. "Now, as I said, I have much to do. I suspect that you will be busy as well. For one thing, you will want to send a message home to your family as soon as you have heard my news." He was clearly caught by surprise. "News? Have you heard something of Galen?" "I fear not, but I have news nonetheless." "You have the advantage of me, Highness. What is afoot? Will you make me wait until tonight to find out?" "I'm surprised you haven't heard already." "We are at war." For a moment, Hendon Tolly actually blanched. Seeing that was worth the humiliation of standing for a quarter of an hour in sweaty clothes. We? Oh, no, not Southmarch and Summerfield Court. Oh, no, not Southmarch and Summerfield Court, Lord Hendon. She laughed and did not try to make it nice. "No, we are family, of course, your folk and mine. In fact, you will no doubt be joining us. All the March kingdoms will be going to war together." What? Against whom?" he asked. Even the girl was looking up now, staring. "Why, against the fairies, of course. Now, you must excuse me. Really, there is a great deal to be done. Our army rides out at dawn tomorrow." She had the immense satisfaction of leaving Hendon Tolly and his companion speechless. But the cut and thrust with him had driven whatever else she was thinking about straight out of her head, and already a dozen other matters were clamoring for attention. She hoped it had been nothing important. Okay, I'm going to start the next section, but we're not going to finish it. Neither Chert nor Beetledown spoke much now. The food was long gone, the water skin was less than half full, and it had become very warm in these very close spaces. Once through the tunnels bored by the Funderlings and into the caverns on the far side, they had passed down a bewildering variety of passages, all perfectly natural, as far as Chert could tell, although it was strange to find natural passages so long and clear. Even though they were not difficult going, in most places he didn't even have to bend his head, they were complex and confusing. If he had been forced to rely on his memories of his own pilgrimage so many years ago, they would have gone far astray. Only Beetledown's near silent communication of directions, pokes and prods and the occasional whispered word, when his nose detected a stronger scent in one direction, gave Chert any hope of finding Flint and getting out again. They were decidedly odd places, these tunnels, and not simply because it was difficult to know whether they were entirely natural. The air might be hot and thick, but there was also a strange sweetness to it that made everyone who breathed it light-headed, adding immeasurably to the awesomeness of the ceremonies that took place in the depths. They were walking along a thin path now, scarcely more than a ledge above a deep emptiness, and Chert was moving very carefully, not least because the light from the first piece of coral was dying. He realized that by any sensible measure they should turn back soon. He hadn't guessed they would be descending so far, and in fact had thought himself quite clever to have brought a second chunk. But now, as he fitted the new lump into the headpiece of polished horn, and the touch of salt water brought it to light, he realized he was one bad choice by a little boulder from being lost in darkness. Chert was a Funderling, and did not panic in the dark or deep places, and his sense of touch and knowledge of the deeps were both well developed. But he still might wander for days before finding his way out, which might be entirely too late for young Flint.
"What does be down here?"
rasped Beetledown suddenly. The thick, perfumed air seemed to be affecting his voice.
"Thy boy, why shouldn't be here at all?"
"I don't know." Chert didn't have much breath for talking either. He wiped sweat from his forehead, then had a moment of fright when he almost brushed his strapped lantern off his head and down into the pit. It's a powerful place. The boy has always been strange. I don't know." As they continued down the narrow path, Chert soon began to wonder whether the fetid air was beginning to choke him or whether something stranger was going on. There were times when he thought he heard voices, just the faintest sighing words, as though one of the guild work gangs were a few hundred steps away down a side passage. At other moments, little flashes of light moved through the greater darkness around him, swift as the flecks that gleamed behind closed eyelids. Such things could be a sign of poisoned air, and in any other place Chert would have turned and retreated. But the air in the deepest part of the mysteries, although never fresh, was also, as far as he knew, never fatal. Beetledown was having real trouble breathing, however. The Thunderling reminded himself that the little man was used to the clean air of the rooftops. In fact, even Chert was beginning to slip in and out of waking dreams about that cold, clean air, so much so that at one point he realized he had wandered only a step from the edge of the path. It was a long way down into blackness, although how long he could only guess. The murmuring continued all around him. It might have been air currents pushed through the tunnels from the halls above by the tide changing. They were far below the sea now. But Chert thought he could hear snatches of words, sobbing, even distant shouts that raised the hackles on his neck. The Temple Brothers came down here, he reminded himself, and they survived it. But the thought did little to ease his fears. Who knew what preparations they made, what secret sacrifices they gave to the lords of these deep places? He considered the holy mystery of the Earth Elders and the quiet, blind voice, and struggled against growing terror. And that's where we're going to stop. Yeah, we're almost 3/4 of the way through the book. So with that, stretch and unkink the hands and wrists. With that, I'm going to stop for the evening. And I want to, as always, thank you for joining me. It's a great pleasure to have you. It's also very interesting to go back to Shadowmarch. As I mentioned, it's only 20 years old, which by now is is a comparatively recent experience from some of the things, compared to some of the things I've been reading, but it's still quite a long time. I mean, you know, it's like each bit as I'm reading it, since I have literally not read it since I wrote it, each piece, as I'm reading it, I'm going like, oh, wait, is this so-and-so? No, oh, wait, no, maybe it's, you know, so it's really, it's not just like a book that I wrote a long time ago. It's a book like that I read a long time ago, and I'm trying to piece together the bits and pieces as I'm going. Anyway, interesting. So, with that, I say good night. Take good care of yourselves. Take good care of the people around you, and anybody, in fact, who needs it if you can. It's been a tough year and a half or so for human beings, and so, you know, do something good for some human beings if you possibly can. If nothing else, do something good for yourself, because you are a human being too. And with that, I say thank you, good night, farewell, travel well, and I will see you next Sunday, either at 2 a.m. or at 7 p.m. my time, and that should do it. So, good night, cheers.